The dusty frontier town of Silver Creek sat quiet under the blazing Arizona sun in the summer of 1876. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his brow as he loaded supplies onto his weathered wagon. He was a simple trader, making his living by hauling goods between remote settlements and trading posts scattered across the harsh desert landscape. At 32 years old, Thomas had grown accustomed to the solitary life on the trails, finding peace in the endless stretches of sand and stone. That morning started like any other. Thomas had spent the previous night at a small trading post run by an old prospector named Dutch Henry. Over coffee and hard biscuits, Dutch had warned him about increased Apache activity in the surrounding hills. Several raiding parties had been spotted, tensions were running high, and the army patrols had been doubled. Thomas listened but wasn't overly concerned. He had always maintained respectful relationships with the native peoples he encountered during his travels, trading fairly and never causing trouble. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas set out on the narrow trail that wound through the rocky canyons toward his next destination, a small settlement called Copper Ridge. The journey would take 3 days if the weather held and the trails remained passable. His wagon creaked under the weight of flour sacks, coffee, tobacco, tools, and other provisions that frontier families desperately needed. The mules plodded steadily forward, their hooves crunching on the gravelly path. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. The canyon wall seemed to trap the scorching air, making it difficult to breathe. Thomas stopped near a small cluster of mesquite trees, seeking whatever shade they could offer. He watered his mules from a leather bucket and took a long drink from his canteen. The water was warm but refreshing nonetheless. He chewed on some dried beef and contemplated the afternoon ahead. Just as Thomas was preparing to continue his journey, he heard something unusual. It was a soft sound, almost like crying, coming from somewhere beyond the rocks. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a wounded coyote or a desert cat. But as he listened more carefully, he realized it was distinctly human. Someone was in distress, and they were close by. Thomas hesitated. Common sense told him to stay with his wagon and mind his own business. The frontier was full of dangers, and getting involved in unknown situations often led to trouble. But his conscience wouldn't allow him to simply ignore someone who might be hurt or dying in this unforgiving wilderness. He secured his mules to a sturdy branch and grabbed his rifle, moving cautiously toward the source of the sound. He climbed over a small ridge of rocks and descended into a narrow ravine. There, partially hidden behind a large boulder, he found her. A young woman lay crumpled on the ground, her dark hair spread around her like a raven's wing. Her dress, made of soft buckskin and decorated with intricate beadwork, was torn and dusty. Blood stained her shoulder and her face was pale with pain and exhaustion. Thomas approached carefully, speaking softly so as not to startle her. When she heard his voice, her eyes flew open, dark and wide with fear. She tried to scramble backward, but a sharp cry of pain stopped her movement. Thomas raised his hands, showing he meant no harm, but the terror in her eyes didn't diminish. He could see she was Apache, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old, and clearly in desperate need of help. Without thinking about the potential consequences, Thomas knew he had to act. He couldn't leave her here to die from her wounds or exposure to the elements. Gently, despite her weak protests, he lifted her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her trembling against him. He carried her back to his wagon, her body tense with fear and pain. Once at the wagon, Thomas carefully set her down in the shade of the mesquite trees. He retrieved his medical supplies, a small kit he always carried for emergencies. The wound on her shoulder appeared to be from a bullet, probably a grazing shot that had torn through the flesh. It needed to be cleaned and bandaged to prevent infection. As he worked, the young woman watched him with suspicious eyes, flinching at his touch but too weak to resist. Thomas spoke to her in the few Apache words he had picked up over the years, trying to reassure her that he was helping, not hurting. He didn't know if she understood, but he kept his voice calm and steady. After cleaning the wound with whiskey that made her gasp in pain, he wrapped it with clean cloth strips. He offered her water, which she accepted reluctantly, drinking in small sips. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas faced a difficult decision. He couldn't leave her here alone, not in her condition, but taking her with him could be seen as kidnapping by her people, an act that could bring swift and terrible retribution. He also didn't know who had shot her, or why. Was she fleeing from soldiers? From her own people? Had she been caught in some conflict he knew nothing about? Despite these concerns, Thomas knew what he had to do. He carefully lifted her into the back of his wagon, arranging the supply sacks to create a comfortable space where she could rest. He covered her with a blanket to protect her from the sun and the curious eyes of anyone they might encounter. The young woman's eyes followed his every movement, still filled with mistrust, but also with a growing confusion. She seemed to be trying to understand why this white stranger was helping her, instead of finishing what someone else had started. Thomas climbed back onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins. The mules started moving again, pulling the wagon deeper into Apache territory. With each mile, Thomas wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had unwittingly taken an Apache Maiden, and he had no idea how this decision would change everything that lay ahead. The trail stretched before him, winding into an uncertain future, and there was no turning back now. The wagon rolled through the afternoon heat as Thomas kept a careful watch on both the trail ahead and the young woman resting in the back. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder to check on her. She lay still, her eyes sometimes open, sometimes closed, but always with that same look of fearful uncertainty. The landscape around them grew more rugged, with towering red rock formations casting long shadows across the desert floor. As evening approached, Thomas knew he needed to find a safe place to camp for the night. He couldn't risk traveling in the darkness, not with his precious cargo and the possibility of Apache warriors searching for the missing girl. He spotted a small canyon with a protective overhang that would shield them from view and provide some shelter. He guided the mules off the main trail and into this hidden spot. Setting up camp was different this time. Usually Thomas would simply start a fire, cook some beans, and settle in for the night. But now he had to consider the young woman's condition and safety. He built only a small fire, just enough to warm some water and prepare food, keeping the smoke minimal to avoid attracting attention. He checked her wound again, relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped and there were no signs of infection yet. The young woman watched him prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. When he offered her a plate, she stared at it for a long moment before slowly accepting it. Her hands trembled slightly as she ate, and Thomas noticed tears streaming silently down her cheeks. He didn't know if they were tears of pain, fear, or something else entirely. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be fine, but he didn't have the words in her language, and he wasn't sure if such promises would even be true. As darkness fell completely, Thomas sat by the small fire, his rifle across his lap. He dozed occasionally but never fell into deep sleep. Every sound in the night made him alert, wondering if Apache warriors were circling the camp. The young woman had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, and he could hear her soft breathing from where she lay in the wagon. The desert night was cool, a stark contrast to the scorching day, and Thomas pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. Morning came with the first light painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Thomas stirred the fire back to life and prepared coffee. The strong, bitter smell seemed to wake the young woman, and she sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. Thomas poured her a cup, adding some sugar to make it more palatable. She accepted it with what might have been a small nod of thanks, the first gesture of acknowledgement she had given him. After breakfast, Thomas faced a crucial decision. He was still 2 days from Copper Ridge, but continuing in that direction meant traveling deeper into territory where Apache warriors were more likely to patrol. He could turn back to Silver Creek, but that meant retracing his path and potentially running into whoever had shot the girl in the first place. Or he could try to find a way to return her to her people safely, though he had no idea where her village might be, or if they would see his intentions as peaceful. As he pondered these options, the young woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft and hesitant, speaking in Apache, but she accompanied her words with hand gestures that Thomas could partially understand. She seemed to be trying to tell him something important, pointing toward the mountains in the distance and then touching her wounded shoulder. Thomas concentrated, trying to piece together her meaning. Through her gestures and the few words they could share, Thomas began to understand fragments of her story. Her name was Ayasha, which he learned meant little one in her language. She had been with a small group from her village when they were attacked. Not by soldiers, as Thomas had assumed, but by a rival group. Perhaps Comancheros or outlaws who preyed on both settlers and native peoples alike. She had been separated from her group during the chaos and had been running for hours before collapsing in that ravine where Thomas found her. This revelation changed everything. If Ayasha's people were looking for her, they would be desperate and dangerous. But they were also likely injured and scattered, trying to regroup after the attack. Thomas realized that the best course of action might be to help Ayasha find her way back to her village, if such a thing was even possible. It was a risk, but perhaps it was the only way to resolve this situation peacefully. Thomas used gestures and simple words to communicate his plan to Ayasha. He would help her get home safely. Her dark eyes studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether she could trust this stranger. Something in his steady gaze and gentle manner must have convinced her because she nodded slowly, then pointed toward the northeast, indicating the direction of her village. They set out again, this time following Ayasha's directions rather than Thomas's planned route to Copper Ridge. The trail became rougher, leading them through narrow passes and across dry creek beds. Thomas worried about his schedule and the supplies he was supposed to deliver, but he had made his choice. Whatever consequences came from this decision, he would face them. Throughout the day, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Ayasha's behavior. Her fear seemed to diminish slightly, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She watched how he handled the mules, how he read the landscape, and how he conserved their water supply. Once, when they stopped to rest, she spoke a few words and pointed to some plants growing near the rocks. Thomas recognized them as medicinal herbs he had seen Apache healers use before. She was showing him, teaching him, perhaps as a way of saying thank you or maybe just to pass the time. By afternoon, they had climbed into higher elevations where the air was cooler, and pine trees began to appear among the rocks. Ayasha's mood shifted, becoming more alert and animated. They were getting close to her homeland, and Thomas could see both hope and worry in her expression. Hope that she would soon be safe among her people, but worry about what reception Thomas might receive. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ayasha suddenly grabbed Thomas's arm and pointed ahead. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a thin column of smoke rising into the air. It could be a campfire, a signal, or a village. Thomas felt his heart beat faster. Whatever happened next would determine both their fates. Thomas stopped the wagon and looked at Ayasha. She met his eyes, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that transcended language and culture. She had been terrified of him at first, seeing only another white man who might harm her. But now she saw someone who had chosen compassion over convenience, who had risked his own safety to help her. And Thomas, who had thought he was simply doing the right thing, now realized that this journey had connected him to something larger than himself, to a world and a people he had only observed from a distance before. With a deep breath, Thomas urged the mules forward, heading toward that distant smoke, toward Ayasha's people, and toward whatever fate awaited him in the Apache camp. The wagon emerged from the pine forest into a clearing, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Before them lay a small Apache encampment, perhaps 20 wickiups arranged in a protective circle. Women tended fires while children played nearby, and several men stood guard at the perimeter. The moment the wagon appeared, everything stopped. The children froze mid-game, women looked up from their work, and the warriors immediately reached for their weapons. Thomas raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible and away from his rifle. He brought the wagon to a stop and remained perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement could be his last. Beside him, Ayasha struggled to stand, calling out in her native language. Her voice was weak but clear enough to carry across the clearing. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A woman near one of the wickiups let out a cry and ran toward the wagon. She was older, perhaps 40, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and a face marked by both hardship and strength. Behind her came a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered face set in grim determination. Thomas understood immediately that these were Ayasha's parents, and the relief and anguish in their expressions told him everything he needed to know about the past 2 days from their perspective. Ayasha's mother reached the wagon first, tears streaming down her face as she helped her daughter down. The two women embraced carefully, mindful of Ayesha's wound. The father approached more slowly, his eyes moving between his daughter and Thomas with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Other villagers began to gather around, all talking at once, examining Ayesha's injury, and casting curious glances at the white trader who had brought her home. Thomas remained on the wagon seat, still keeping his hands visible. Ayesha was speaking rapidly to her parents, gesturing toward Thomas and then to her shoulder. He could only hope she was explaining that he had helped her, not harmed her. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Ayesha's father asking questions and Ayesha responding with animated gestures and explanations. Finally, the father turned to Thomas and spoke in heavily accented English. His name was Niall, which meant wind, and he was a respected warrior and hunter in his tribe. He asked Thomas directly how he had come to find his daughter, and why he had brought her here instead of taking her to the white man's fort for a reward. There had been, Thomas learned, bounties offered for the return of Apache captives, and many white men would have seen Ayesha as an opportunity for profit. Thomas climbed down from the wagon slowly, making no threatening moves. He explained the truth in simple words. He had found Ayesha wounded and alone, he had treated her injury, and he had brought her home because it was the right thing to do. He wanted no reward, no recognition, just to see her safely returned to her family. As he spoke, he could see Niall studying him carefully, weighing his words and his manner. The tension in the camp remained high. Some of the younger warriors clearly viewed Thomas with suspicion, perhaps even hostility. They had lost friends and family members in conflicts with white settlers and soldiers, and trust did not come easily. But Ayesha continued to speak on his behalf, telling her people about his kindness and care. Her mother, whose name was Kesa, also seemed to soften toward him, perhaps recognizing the genuine concern he had shown for her daughter. As the sun began to set, Niall made a decision. He invited Thomas to stay in their camp for the night, to share a meal and rest before continuing his journey. It was both an invitation and a test. Thomas understood that his behavior over the next few hours would determine whether he left the camp as a friend or a prisoner, or perhaps not at all. He accepted the invitation with a respectful nod, knowing he had no real choice in the matter. The evening meal was a communal affair. Thomas sat near the central fire, surrounded by Apache families who watched him with varying degrees of curiosity and wariness. Ayesha and her family sat nearby, and occasionally she would translate or explain something to bridge the gap between their worlds. The food was simple but nourishing: venison stew, corn cakes, and roasted roots. Thomas ate gratefully, complimenting the cooking through Ayesha's translation, which brought small smiles to some of the women's faces. As the meal concluded, an elderly man approached the fire. His face was deeply lined, his body bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. This was the village elder, a man named Kile, whose name meant sparrowhawk. He had been listening to all the discussions about Thomas and Ayesha, and now he wanted to speak with the white trader directly. Through Ayesha's translation, Kale asked Thomas many questions about his life, his travels, his beliefs, and his understanding of the Apache people. Thomas answered honestly, admitting his limited knowledge but also his respect for the Apache way of life. He spoke of the many times he had traded fairly with native peoples, of the friendships he had formed at various trading posts, and of his belief that all people deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Kaylee listened carefully, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions that probed deeper into Thomas's character and intentions. The conversation stretched long into the night, with others in the camp listening quietly. Thomas realized this was more than just idle curiosity. It was a judgment being passed on him and perhaps on all white men through him. He felt the weight of that responsibility but tried to remain true to himself, neither exaggerating his virtues nor hiding his flaws. He was just a simple trader who had tried to do the right thing, and if that wasn't enough, then so be it. Finally, Kale seemed satisfied. He spoke to Niall and the other warriors in Apache, and though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had hung over the camp since his arrival began to ease. Niall stood and approached Thomas, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that seemed to signify acceptance, at least tentatively. Through Ayesha's translation, Neil explained that Thomas had done a great service for their family and their tribe. Ayasha was precious to them, not just as a daughter but as someone who held special meaning in their community. By saving her life and bringing her home safely, asking nothing in return, Thomas had demonstrated a character that deserved recognition and respect. The village would remember this act, and Thomas would always be welcome in their camp. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, but also something deeper, a sense of connection to these people and their way of life. He had crossed a boundary that few white men crossed, moving from stranger to honored guest through a single act of compassion. As he prepared to sleep that night, rolled in blankets near the fire, Thomas reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had set out to deliver supplies to Copper Ridge, a routine journey he had made many times before. Instead, he had found himself at the heart of an Apache village, accepted by people who had every reason to hate and fear him. Ayasha approached him before he fell asleep, moving carefully because of her injury. Through gestures and the few English words she had learned, she thanked him again for saving her life. In her eyes, Thomas saw not just gratitude but a kind of wonder, as if she was as surprised by his actions as he had been by the whole situation. She gave him a small leather pouch containing herbs for his journey, a gift from her mother to ensure his safe travels. As Thomas drifted off to sleep under the vast expanse of stars, he couldn't help but think about how a single choice had changed everything. He had chosen to investigate a cry for help instead of ignoring it. He had chosen compassion over caution, humanity over fear, and now, lying in an Apache camp surrounded by people who had become unlikely friends, he understood that the most important journeys were often the ones we never planned to take. Morning light filtered through the pine trees as Thomas woke to the sounds of the Apache camp coming to life. Children laughed and played while women prepared the morning meal, and men checked weapons and discussed the day's hunting plans. For a moment, Thomas felt disoriented, forgetting where he was. But then the memories of the previous days came flooding back. He sat up, stretching his stiff muscles, and found Casa approaching with a bowl of warm corn porridge and some dried fruit. She smiled at him, a genuine smile that erased years from her careworn face, and gestured for him to eat. Thomas accepted gratefully, touched by the kindness. As he ate, Neil approached and sat beside him. Through a combination of basic English, hand gestures, and patience, Neil explained that scouts had been sent out at first light. They had found tracks of the men who had attacked Ayasha's group, the same outlaws who had been terrorizing both Apache and settlers in the region. These were dangerous men who cared for nothing but their own profit, stealing horses, kidnapping women and children to sell, and killing anyone who got in their way. Neil's face darkened as he spoke about these men. 3 members of their village had been killed in the attack, and several others wounded. Ayasha had been fortunate that Thomas found her when he did, as the outlaws had been searching for survivors to capture. The Apache warriors wanted revenge, but they were also practical. They needed to protect their village and their people, and they couldn't risk losing more lives in a direct confrontation with well-armed criminals. As Thomas listened, an idea began to form in his mind. He knew the territory well from his years of trading, and he had contacts at various army forts and settlements. Perhaps there was a way to help these people, while also addressing a threat that affected everyone in the region, white settlers and Apache alike. He shared his thoughts with Neil, suggesting that they could work together to track these outlaws and bring them to justice, either through the army or through their own combined efforts. Neil was skeptical at first. The Apache had little reason to trust the army, which had been responsible for driving them from their traditional lands and forcing them onto reservations. Many soldiers saw all Apaches as enemies, making no distinction between peaceful villages and raiding parties. But Thomas argued that this situation was different. These outlaws were wanted men, and there would be rewards for their capture. More importantly, stopping them would save lives on both sides. The discussion continued throughout the morning, with other warriors joining in and offering their perspectives. Some were adamant that they should handle the matter themselves according to Apache tradition. Others saw wisdom in Thomas's suggestion, recognizing that cooperation might be the only way to ensure the outlaws faced real justice. Finally, Kale, the village elder, was consulted. After listening to all arguments, he made his pronouncement. They would send a small party, including both Apache warriors and Thomas, to track the outlaws and gather information. If an opportunity arose to capture them, they would take it. If not, they would report their findings to the nearest army post and let the soldiers handle it. But the key was that they would work together, combining Apache tracking skills with Thomas's knowledge of the white man's world. It was a compromise that satisfied most of the camp, though some younger warriors grumbled about involving an outsider in tribal business. Ayasha, despite her injury, insisted on helping with preparations. She couldn't ride with the hunting party, but she could provide valuable information about the attack and the men who had perpetrated it. She described their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes who spoke both English and Spanish, and several others who seemed to follow his commands without question. She told them about the direction the outlaws had fled and the pace they were keeping, information that would be crucial for tracking them down. By midday, the party was ready to depart. It consisted of Niall and 3 other experienced warriors, plus Thomas with his wagon and supplies. They would travel light and fast, leaving the wagon behind after the first day if necessary. Thomas checked his rifle and packed extra ammunition, hoping he wouldn't need it but knowing the danger they faced. Casa prepared food for their journey, while Ayasha pressed more medicinal herbs into Thomas's hands, perhaps fearing for his safety as much as her father's. Before they left, Ayasha spoke to Thomas privately away from the others. Her English had improved remarkably over the past day, picking up words and phrases quickly. She thanked him again for saving her life, but more than that, she thanked him for treating her with dignity and respect when he could have done otherwise. She told him that not all white men were like him, and she hoped he would be careful on this dangerous mission. There was something in her eyes, a concern that went beyond simple gratitude, and Thomas felt a stirring of emotion he hadn't expected. The tracking party set out, moving swiftly through the forest and down into the lower elevations where the outlaws had last been seen. The Apache warriors moved like shadows, reading signs in the landscape that Thomas could barely perceive. Niall would occasionally point out tracks or disturbed vegetation, explaining what it told them about their quarry. Thomas was impressed by their skill and began to understand why Apache warriors were so feared by their enemies. By evening, they had covered significant ground and found clear evidence of the outlaws' passage. A hastily abandoned campsite revealed they were traveling with stolen goods, including Apache artifacts and personal items taken during the raid. This discovery hardened the warriors' resolve and confirmed they were on the right trail. They made their own camp in a defensible position, posting guards throughout the night. The next morning brought unexpected developments. As they continued tracking, they encountered a small group of Mexican traders who had narrowly escaped an attack by the same outlaws just hours before. The traders were terrified, having lost most of their goods but grateful to have kept their lives. Through Thomas's translation, they provided crucial information about the outlaws' numbers, weapons, and apparent destination. The criminals were heading toward an abandoned mining camp in the hills, possibly to hide their stolen goods before splitting up. This intelligence changed the situation dramatically. If they could reach the mining camp before the outlaws scattered, they might be able to capture the entire gang at once. But it would require speed and careful planning. Niall and Thomas consulted with the other warriors, mapping out a strategy that would use the terrain to their advantage. They would position themselves around the camp, wait until the outlaws were inside and distracted by dividing their loot, then move in to surround them. The risk was significant. The outlaws were dangerous men, experienced fighters who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their freedom and their stolen wealth. But the potential reward was equally significant: justice for the murdered Apache, safety for the region, and perhaps most importantly, a demonstration that Apache and whites could work together for the common good. It was exactly the kind of gesture that might help bridge the deep divide between their peoples. As they approached the abandoned mining camp, Thomas felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had gotten himself into situations before, faced dangers on the frontier, but nothing quite like this. He was about to participate in what could become a fierce gunfight, not for profit or personal gain, but for justice and for the honor of the people who had accepted him into their circle. He checked his rifle one more time, exchanged determined looks with Niall and the other warriors, and moved into position. The old mining camp lay silent below them, apparently empty, but smoke rising from one of the dilapidated buildings told them someone was inside. They could hear voices, rough laughter, and the sounds of men celebrating their successful raid. The outlaws had no idea that justice, in the form of an unlikely alliance between an Apache warrior and a white trader, was closing in around them. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine the fate of many people, and might even change the course of relations between two cultures that had been at war for generations. The abandoned mining camp sprawled across a small valley, its weathered buildings leaning at odd angles like broken teeth. Thomas crouched behind a large boulder with one of the Apache warriors, a young man named Cha'ak whose name meant Crier Chief. They had positioned themselves on the eastern side of the camp while Neol and the others took positions to the west and north, effectively boxing in the outlaws. The plan was to wait until Thomas could call out to them, giving them one chance to surrender before the warriors closed in. The sounds from inside the main building grew louder as the outlaws celebrated their successful raid. Thomas could hear at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more, all speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish. They were dividing up the stolen goods, arguing over who deserved what share. Glass bottles clinked together, suggesting they had found whiskey somewhere and were getting drunk. This worked in favor of Thomas and the warriors, as intoxicated men made poor fighters, but it also made them more unpredictable and dangerous. Neol gave the signal, a soft bird call that carried across the valley. It was time. Thomas stood up slowly, his rifle held at the ready but not aimed directly at the building. He took a deep breath and called out in a strong, clear voice. He identified himself as a trader and citizen, informed the outlaws they were surrounded by Apache warriors, and that he was giving them one chance to come out peacefully with their hands up. If they surrendered, they would be taken to the nearest army fort for trial. If they resisted, they would face Apache justice. For a moment, there was complete silence from inside the building. Then angry shouting erupted and a gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the boulder near Thomas, sending rock fragments flying. That was their answer. The peaceful option had been rejected, and now there was no choice but to take them by force. Thomas ducked back down as more shots followed, the outlaws firing wildly in all directions, unsure where their attackers were positioned. The Apache warriors moved with practiced precision, closing in on the building from 3 sides while staying in cover. They returned fire with careful, measured shots, not wasting ammunition but making each bullet count. Thomas added his own gunfire, aiming at the windows and doorway to keep the outlaws pinned down. The battle was fierce but brief, lasting perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to Thomas as adrenaline coursed through his veins. One of the outlaws made a desperate break for the horses tied behind the building, but Cha'ak cut him off with a warning shot that convinced the man to throw down his weapon and raise his hands. Another tried to escape through a back window but found himself facing 2 Apache warriors with arrows drawn. The reality of their situation was becoming clear to the outlaws. They were outmaneuvered and outmatched by warriors who knew this terrain intimately. Finally, a white flag appeared in one of the windows. Actually, a dirty shirt waved on the end of a rifle barrel. A voice called out, requesting terms for surrender. Thomas, with Neol's approval, offered them the same deal as before. Come out with hands up, surrender all weapons and stolen goods, and they would be taken for trial rather than killed on the spot. After a tense moment of consultation inside the building, the outlaws began to emerge one by one, hands raised, faces showing fear and defeat. There were 7 of them in total, a rough-looking bunch with hard eyes and weathered faces. Their leader was indeed the scarred man Ayasha had described, and recognition and hatred flashed in his eyes when he saw the Apache warriors. He spat on the ground and muttered something about savages, but Neol's stern expression and ready weapons kept him from saying more. The warriors quickly bound the prisoners' hands and collected their weapons, a considerable arsenal that included stolen army rifles and pistols. The stolen goods were recovered from inside the building. There were Apache artifacts and personal items, confirming these were the men who had attacked the village. There were also items stolen from Mexican traders and white settlers, evidence of a crime spree that had terrorized the region for months. Thomas documented everything carefully, knowing it would be needed for the trial. He also found something that made his blood run cold, a list of potential targets, including the Apache village where Ayasha's family lived and the settlement of Copper Ridge where he had been heading. With the prisoners secured and the evidence gathered, the group began the journey back. They stopped first at the Apache village to show the people that justice had been served and to return the stolen items to their rightful owners. The reception was jubilant, with people celebrating the success of the mission and the cooperation between Thomas and the warriors. Ayasha, whose shoulder was healing well, greeted them with relief and pride in her eyes, especially when she looked at Thomas. The village held a feast that evening to celebrate and to honor the dead who had been killed in the original attack. Thomas was given a place of honor at the gathering, and Cale the elder spoke about the significance of what had been accomplished. He said that for too long their peoples had seen only the worst in each other, allowing fear and hatred to drive them apart. But Thomas had shown that there were good men among the whites just as there were good men among the Apache. This cooperation had not only brought criminals to justice, but had also opened a door that had been closed for too long. The following morning, Thomas prepared to escort the prisoners to Fort Grant, the nearest army post. Neol and one other warrior, a man named Bidzil, would accompany him to provide testimony about the crimes and to ensure the outlaws faced proper justice. It was a significant gesture of trust, as Apache warriors rarely ventured willingly into army territory. But Neol explained that this was too important to leave to chance. They wanted to see this through to the end. Before they departed, Ayasha approached Thomas one final time. Her wound was healing nicely, thanks to her mother's care and the natural resilience of youth. She stood before him with a mixture of emotions playing across her face, gratitude and respect, but also something deeper that neither of them could quite put into words. She gave him a small leather bracelet she had made, woven with intricate patterns that held meaning in Apache culture. Through halting English and gestures, she explained it was a symbol of protection and friendship, something to remember her by. Thomas accepted the gift with genuine appreciation, feeling the weight of what it represented. In just a few short days, this young woman had gone from a terrified stranger to someone he genuinely cared about. He promised her that he would return to visit the village once his business at the fort was concluded, and he saw hope light up in her eyes at those words. Kesa embraced him like a son, and even the warriors who had initially been suspicious now clasped his arm in friendship. The journey to Fort Grant took 3 days, with the prisoners bound and walking ahead of Thomas's wagon, while Neol and Bidzil rode alongside. The outlaws were sullen and defeated, knowing they faced serious charges that could mean years in prison or worse. When they finally arrived at the fort, the commanding officer, Captain Harrison, was initially suspicious of the Apache warriors, but Thomas vouched for them and explained the entire situation. Captain Harrison listened carefully to the account, examining the evidence and questioning both Thomas and Neol through a translator. The stolen goods, the list of targets, and the testimony of multiple witnesses painted a clear picture of the outlaws' crimes. The captain was particularly interested in the cooperation between Thomas and the Apache, recognizing that such partnerships could be crucial for maintaining peace in the territory. He assured them the outlaws would be tried fairly and that their crimes against the Apache would be given proper weight in the proceedings. What happened next surprised everyone. Captain Harrison proposed a more formal arrangement, suggesting that Thomas could serve as a liaison between the army and the Apache villages in the region. His unique position as a trusted trader who had proven himself to both sides made him ideal for such a role. He could help facilitate communication, warn of potential threats, and assist in resolving conflicts before they escalated into violence. It was an unprecedented proposal, but these were unprecedented times. Thomas was taken aback by the offer. It would mean significant changes to his life, transforming him from a simple trader into something more complex and potentially dangerous. But he also recognized the opportunity it represented. How many lives could be saved if there was better understanding between the two cultures? How much suffering could be prevented if someone stood in the middle, trusted by both sides? He asked for time to consider the proposal, and Captain Harrison agreed, suggesting he discuss it with Neol and the village elders. On the return journey to the Apache village, Thomas and Neol talked extensively about the captain's proposal. Neol admitted that his people were weary of war and conflict. They wanted peace, but they also wanted respect and fair treatment. If Thomas could help bridge that gap, if he could ensure their voices were heard and their concerns addressed, then perhaps there was hope for a better future. Bidzil, who had been quiet for most of the journey, added his own perspective. He spoke of children growing up in fear, of families torn apart by violence, and of the dream that someday, Apache and whites might live side by side without bloodshed. By the time they reached the Ville, 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Thomas found Ayasha wounded in the ravine. The seasons had changed, bringing cooler weather to the high desert, and with those changes came transformation in the lives of everyone involved. Thomas had accepted Captain Harrison's proposal and now served as an official liaison between the Army and several Apache villages in the region. It was challenging work that required patience, wisdom, and constant travel, but it was also deeply rewarding. His efforts had already borne fruit. Several potential conflicts had been defused through better communication and understanding. Trading relationships had been established that benefited both Apache families and white settlers. Most importantly, a fragile trust was beginning to develop between peoples who had been enemies for generations. Not everyone was happy with these developments, as there were extremists on both sides who preferred the old ways of violence and revenge, but the majority recognized the value of peace. Thomas's relationship with Ayasha had deepened as well, though in ways neither of them had anticipated. She had become his translator and guide, helping him understand Apache customs and traditions more deeply. Her intelligence and natural gift for languages had proven invaluable, and she often accompanied him on his diplomatic missions. Neil had initially been protective and hesitant about his daughter spending so much time with a white man, but he had come to respect Thomas's honorable intentions and Ayasha's own choices. The trading post Thomas had established near the Apache village had become a neutral meeting ground where people from different cultures could interact peacefully. White settlers came to purchase Apache crafts and trade goods, while Apache families could obtain supplies they needed without risking dangerous journeys to distant towns. The post was simple, just a wooden building with a covered porch, but it represented something larger, the possibility of coexistence. One autumn evening, as Thomas sat on that porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Ayasha joined him. She had something important to discuss, and her serious expression told him it wasn't just casual conversation. She spoke about her dreams for the future, about a world where Apache children could grow up without fear, where they could learn from both cultures and benefit from the best of each. She spoke about education, about teaching Apache youth to read and write English while also preserving their own language and traditions. Thomas listened carefully, recognizing the passion and wisdom in her words. Ayasha had grown tremendously over the past months, transforming from a frightened victim into a strong advocate for her people. He found himself falling in love with her mind and spirit as much as anything else, but he also understood the complications such feelings created. Marriages between whites and Apaches were rare and often met with disapproval from both communities. The path ahead would not be easy if they chose to walk it together. Yet even as he contemplated these challenges, Thomas received news that changed everything. Captain Harrison sent word that the territorial governor wanted to meet with him and representatives from the Apache villages. The successful liaison program was drawing attention, and there was talk of expanding it across the territory. More than that, there were discussions about formal treaties that would guarantee Apache rights to certain lands and establish clear boundaries that both sides would respect. This was an opportunity Thomas had hardly dared to hope for, but it also presented enormous challenges. The Apache elders would need to decide who would represent them at these negotiations, and there would be intense debates about what terms they could accept. Some feared any treaty with the government, having seen too many promises broken in the past. Others recognized this might be their best chance for a lasting peace that would protect future generations. Thomas and Ayasha traveled from village to village, explaining the governor's invitation and listening to people's concerns and hopes. It was during one of these journeys that their relationship reached a turning point. They had made camp under the stars, as they often did, and Ayasha finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. She loved him, not just as a friend or ally, but as a partner she wanted to spend her life with. She understood the difficulties this would create, but she believed their love could be a symbol of the larger reconciliation they were working toward. Thomas's response came from his heart. He had loved her for some time but had been hesitant to speak of it, fearing it would complicate their work or put her in a difficult position within her community. But hearing her confession released something in him, and he admitted his own feelings. They embraced under the starlight, knowing they were choosing a difficult path but one they wanted to walk together. They decided to seek her father's blessing, though they knew it would require courage and honest conversation. Niall's reaction was complex when they approached him. As a father, he worried about his daughter's happiness and the challenges she would face in a mixed marriage. As a leader, he understood the symbolic importance of such a union, showing that the two peoples could truly become one family. After much consideration and discussion with Casa, he gave his blessing. But with one condition. They must do this properly, honoring both Apache and white traditions, demonstrating respect for both cultures. The wedding took place on a spring day, combining elements from both traditions. Kaylee performed the Apache ceremonies while a traveling preacher Thomas knew conducted Christian rites. Members of both communities attended, some enthusiastically, others with reservations, but all bearing witness to something unprecedented. Captain Harrison himself came to represent the Army and the territorial government, his presence lending official recognition to the Union. The negotiations with the territorial governor took place shortly after the wedding, with Thomas and Ayasha presenting a united front. The Apache elders had chosen them to speak on behalf of several villages, recognizing that their unique perspective and partnership embodied the kind of relationship they hoped to establish with the government. The talks were difficult, with many setbacks and disagreements, but eventually, a treaty was drafted that gave the Apache guaranteed access to traditional lands, hunting rights, and educational opportunities while establishing clear peace terms. The treaty wasn't perfect, and Thomas knew that maintaining peace would require constant work and vigilance. There would always be those who opposed cooperation, who wanted to return to the old ways of conflict and separation, but something fundamental had shifted. A door had been opened, and people on both sides were walking through it, tentatively at first but with growing confidence. Thomas often reflected on that day in the ravine when he first found Ayasha. He could never have imagined that stopping to help a wounded stranger would lead to all of this. A new career, a partnership with the Apache people, a wife he loved deeply, and a role in forging peace in a troubled territory. It reminded him that the most important choices in life often come in small moments. Decisions that seem insignificant at the time, but ripple outward to touch countless lives. 2 years after that fateful day, Thomas and Ayasha stood together on the porch of their expanded trading post, watching their infant daughter sleep peacefully in her cradle. The child represented the future they were building, a future where Apache and white heritage could coexist in one person, in one family, and hopefully in one peaceful territory. Around them, life continued as Apache families and white settlers conducted business, shared meals, and slowly learned to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. The journey from that desperate moment in the ravine to this peaceful scene had been long and difficult, filled with challenges and dangers neither could have predicted. But Thomas had made a choice that day to help rather than ignore, to risk rather than play it safe, and that choice had altered his fate forever. He had gained not just a wife and family but a purpose larger than himself, a mission to bridge the divide between two worlds that desperately needed connection. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Thomas held Ayasha's hand and looked toward the future with hope. The past could not be undone, and the wounds between their peoples would take generations to fully heal. But they had made a start, proven that cooperation was possible, and shown that love could transcend the boundaries of culture and race. Their daughter would grow up in a world different from the one her parents had known, a world where such unions were less shocking and more accepted, where peace was not just a distant dream but a daily reality being built one relationship at a time. Thomas often told people that he had simply done what